If you ever have to choose between listening to your wife and listening to God, you should probably listen to God. Hey, I'm Tristan with the Tree Smiths, and today we're going to be continuing into part 3 of the story of Abraham. So when we left off, we talked about Abraham and Lot, about how Lot had unfortunately ended up in Sodom, and there's going to be more to that story to come that probably most of you know. But we finished off in chapter number 15, where the Lord comes to him and he confirms to him that he did right, he did good. He tells him, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. But then we come here to a conversation between the Lord and Abraham, or Abram, whatever you want to call him. And this conversation is basically Abraham's concern that he hasn't had any children. Now, if you remember back in chapter number 12, the Lord has already promised to Abraham that I'm going to bless thy seed, that he's going to bless his seed with this land. And so that's Abraham knowing from God that, well, in order for God to bless my seed with this land, he's going to have to bless my seed. And at this point, Abraham doesn't have any children yet. And him and Sarah are getting on up in years, and they still haven't had any children. And so the Lord is talking to Abraham, and he's telling him, Abraham is asking that I've got a servant, and this is my chief servant, Eliezer, that's in his household, and he's asking him, is this going to be the heir to my house? Is this going to be the heir to basically my name and to my household, and is this going to be the one that you can bless? And the Lord tells him no. He tells him that I'm going to bless you with a son. I'm going to bless you with a seed of your loins. I'm going to bless you with somebody that's of your blood directly. And the Lord tells him not only is he going to bless him, but he is going to bless him so much so that Abraham's seed is going to be numbered as the stars in the sky. And again, he's going to tell them that they're not just going to be numbered as the stars in the sky, but as many as the dust of the earth. And he's given him this promise. And so then, going on in chapter 15, we see here that a covenant is going to take place. And when the covenant starts, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on this covenant, because there is so much to this that is over my head, and I'm just going to try to keep it simple for you, okay? The Lord is going to make a covenant with Abraham. When you start reading it, it looks like that it's going to be a ritual that God and Abraham are going to perform together. But however, what ends up happening is a deep sleep falls upon Abraham, and the Lord completes the covenant without Abraham. That is exciting. It's exciting because if you believe this Bible, then you have probably learned by now that you, as a man or as a woman, you fail, and you are going to fail, and you are going to keep failing. Even after you're saved, even after you have Jesus in your heart, you're still going to fail. And so what's exciting about this is you should always be leery of covenants that you have to make between you and God. What you should be excited about is covenants that God makes to you. Because when God makes the covenant, He's not going to break the covenant. When God makes the covenant to you, He's going to make sure that the covenant is upheld. If you have to make a covenant with God, then you both have a part in it, and you can break it, and you can fail, and thus end in the covenant. But if God makes the covenant to you and for you, then you're trusting God and His strength. You're trusting God and His perfection, that He is going to continue that covenant. So that's what the Lord does. He seals this covenant for Abraham. And then while he's there with him making the covenant, He also tells Abraham, he gives him a prophecy that you should know of surety that your people are going to have to live in a land that is not theirs. That they're going to have to live and be slaves in a land for 400 years. And before I bring you out. Now, they're going to multiply greatly there, and they're going to get blessed there. And what he's talking about, he's given the prophecy about the people of Israel, the people of the Hebrews, dwelling in Egypt, okay? And if you're following along and you do know the Bible, you know that when we get to the end of Genesis, God is going to use Moses to get the people into Egypt. And He's going to bless them there. He's going to multiply them there. But then things are going to start to sour, and they're going to have to get out there. They're going to have to get out of there. And thus we have the whole book of Exodus and the Exodus, okay? And so this is God telling Abraham of that prophecy. But the Lord has assured him that I am going to bless you with children. I am going to bless you with a seed. And so we get here to chapter number 16. In chapter number 16, and we don't know exactly how much time has went by, but in chapter number 16, we see that Sarai, or Sarah, however you want to say it, she still is barren. She still has had no children. And this is concerning to her, and she's growing impatient. Abraham's probably growing impatient as well, but it's always a hard thing to deal with when you're dealing with something as a man, but it's also bothering your spouse, and it's bothering your spouse even more than it's bothering you, because when it bothers your spouse, it bothers you. And they're in a marriage, they're together, and they love one another. And Abraham loves his wife, and he wants to see this promise fulfilled, but he also wants to see his wife happy. And so Sarah comes up with this plan, and now we're going to circle back to part number 1, where Abraham went down to Egypt. And when he went down to Egypt, he shouldn't have, but when he went down to Egypt, some things happened down there, and he brought back some things that he shouldn't. One of the things that I told you about was that there's a very good chance that when Lot was down in Egypt, he got to seeing some things that gave him an appetite for the world. And that's probably part of what played into the hand of him ending up pitching his tent toward Sodom and then eventually ending up in Sodom. And then we're eventually going to see just how bad Sodom was. But that's one thing. The other thing that happened is when they came out of Egypt, they bought them a servant, or got them a servant while they were down there. They got them a little Egyptian servant girl by the name of Hagar, okay? And this is a particular servant. This isn't just any servant. And again, we have to remember Abraham, huge household, okay? No telling how many people were around there, no telling how many the compound that he had, because we know he had at least 318 trained servants. There's no telling how many he had, but this one servant in particular, this one servant is going to cause a great problem, not just for Abraham's home, but for Abraham's entire lineage. And so we continue with the story here. Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Now, I want to say something here, all right? Just because you can find it in the Bible does not mean that it is okay. Just because you can find an example of it in the Bible does not mean that it was God's idea. It does not mean that God orchestrated it. It does not mean that God is okay with it. It doesn't mean that it's God's will. So we find here that Sarah is growing impatient about not having a child. She thinks she's barren and there's no hope for her. I'm going to cut this off for just a minute until those sirens stop. Sorry about that. I'm a redneck. I live in the South, and somebody set the woods on fire. Just another day of operating here in the South. But don't worry if you see smoke pluming behind me. It wasn't me this time, all right? So continuing on in the story here, Sarah, she was getting impatient by the fact that she had not had a child yet. She thought that she was barren and that there was no hope for her. And so she goes and she tells Abram, hey, I've got an idea. I know we're married, but what if you marry Hagar? Hagar is the Egyptian servant that they picked up in Egypt that they should have never had. What if you go and marry Hagar also, and you see if you can have a child with her? And so that's exactly what he does. He goes along with the plan, and he marries Hagar, and sure enough, now Hagar is with child. And I know some of you guys that are married, you're not going to believe this, but can you believe that if you start reading this story, what you find out is that there was strife in their home after he married a second woman, and now she's with child. Can you believe that? Can you believe there's drama in between two women that are married to the same guy? It's almost like that's a terrible idea and you should never do it, because it's a terrible idea and you should never do it. And so that's why I said that just because you find this here, this example, just because Abraham was a man of faith, just because you can find it in the Bible does not mean that it was okay. This was not a God-ordained marriage. This was out of the will of God, okay? And God is going to bring judgment to this decision ultimately, and I'll show you how towards the end. It's not going to turn out good, but the story goes on. So now there's strife in the home, and Sarah is all upset because, Hagar is looking at her differently, and well, no duh, between what happened, of course she's looking at her differently. And basically Abraham, you know, being the wise man of the house, he basically just says, you know, I'm not dealing with this, all right? She's your handmaid. You know, if you're upset about it, you deal with it, all right? And so then Sarah, she deals harshly with Hagar, and they run her off. They run her out of the house, and she leaves. And then we see here something miraculous, and here is just, again, a testimony to the Lord Jesus Christ and the love that he has. Hagar has no business being in this home. Hagar had no business being married to Abraham. Hagar has no business being with child from Abraham's seed, but nonetheless, when she leaves, she's still a soul and she's still a person, and we see that she is visited out in the wilderness by the angel of the Lord. And do you remember what the angel of the Lord is? The angel of the Lord is none other than a pre-incarnate of Jesus Christ. And so Jesus Christ, he comes down here to visit with Hagar, and he comes down here to comfort her, and he tells her that you need to return, you need to go back home, but he tells her that I'm going to bless your child as well. I'm going to bless his name, and I'm going to bless his seed. His name is going to be called Ishmael. And so here is a warning that you can absolutely mistreat the blessings from God. All right, and I know things probably transpired a little bit differently in the Old Testament than they do now, but nevertheless, God gives us a lot of blessings. And when he gives us blessings, be sure that we don't abuse those blessings, because Abraham already had a blessing on his life. And so that tells me he had a blessing from God on his seed, okay? And when Abraham had a child with Hagar, that same blessing is now going to translate to that child, Ishmael. That's not good. And I'll tell you why that's not good. It's not good because if you go and you study history, what you can find is that the guy that started the Muslim religion, okay, he can be traced back to being a descendant of none other than Ishmael. And so it is so ironic, but sad at the same time, that the very man who fathers the Hebrew nation, who fathers and begins the nation of Israel, is also going to father the people of the Muslims that are going to give more strife to not just Israel, but going to give more strife to this entire world than any other people throughout history. And they both came from the same loins. They both came from the same loins because Ishmael came from a mistake that Abraham made, a mistake that he had, a lapse in judgment that he had when he listened to this plan, when he listened to this scheme from Sarah that he would rush things. And they both were out of the will of God. I'm not trying to put all the blame on Sarah. They both were out of the will of God. Abraham should have had enough wherewithal to say, no, Sarah, this is a terrible idea. I know it's hard, but you need to just be patient and trust God. God said he was going to do it, and he's going to do it. Because this son that they have, Ishmael, this is not the seed. This is not the promised seed. This is not the promised son. We know that it's going to be Isaac. If you read ahead, we're probably going to save that for a different day. But we see here that the Lord says that he's going to bless his seed, and his name is going to be called Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And it says that he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Man, who does that sound like? It sounds like the Muslims that are out here blowing up the whole world, and they hate everybody that's not a Muslim. And for the ones that say they're not a radical Muslim, let me translate that for you. What that means is they are not a devout Muslim. All right, just like we have people out here that say that they're Christians, but they don't go to church, they don't read their Bible, they don't pray, they don't live like a Christian. They might say that they're a Christian, but they're not really a Christian. Because if the Muslims actually study what they call their Bible, all right, if they actually follow after their religion in a true form, they all are led to the same understanding that they hate and want to bring death to everyone that is not a Muslim, to everyone that does not believe in Allah for being the one true God. And all that starts right here in Genesis chapter 16, where Abraham gets out of the will of God and he has Ishmael with Hagar, his second wife, who's not really a wife because God didn't ordain that marriage. And they have Ishmael, and it just man, it brings all kinds of strife to their home. And we're already running a little long, so I'm not going to get into it today. We're going to save that for the next part. This is turning into a lot more parts than I thought, but there is just so much to the life of Abraham. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.